I knew my world was about to implode the moment David Torres walked into the conference room carrying that pristine leather portfolio and wearing the kind of smile that costs extra at business school. It was 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. The Seattle rain was drumming against the windows of our 15th-floor conference room, and I was about to hear the three words that would change everything. Streamline operational efficiency. Not because those words were inherently terrifying, though they should be to anyone who's worked in corporate America long enough. No, it was the way David said them while looking directly at me, his eyes holding that particular brand of condescension reserved for people who think their MBA gives them X-ray vision into everyone else's incompetence. I'd seen that look before, usually right before someone half my experience explained my own job to me. "Jessica," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture so rehearsed it might as well have been choreographed, "we've been reviewing the technological infrastructure across all North Star logistics facilities, and frankly what we've found is concerning." I felt my coffee cup grow heavier in my hands. 10 years I'd been at this company. 10 years of building something from the ground up, of staying late to debug code while everyone else went home to their families, of turning what was essentially a digital disaster into the most efficient supply chain management system on the West Coast. And here was David Torres, all of 6 weeks into his tenure as Director of Strategic Operations, telling me my life's work was concerning. "The inventory management platform you've been maintaining," he continued, consulting his notes with the theatrical precision of someone who'd practiced this speech. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It's what we in the industry call legacy architecture. Outdated, inefficient, a bottleneck that's preventing us from reaching our full potential. Legacy architecture." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were accurate, but because they were so breathtakingly ignorant. My system wasn't legacy anything. It was cutting-edge technology wrapped in an interface so intuitive that warehouse staff who'd never touched a computer before were running complex inventory analyses within their first week. It was the reason our facility processed 40% more volume than any other North Star location while maintaining the lowest error rate in company history. But David wasn't finished. He clicked his pen twice, a nervous habit I'd already cataloged during our previous interactions, and delivered the killing blow. "We'll be implementing Innovate Tech Solutions LogiStream Pro across all facilities by the end of. It's a proven enterprise-level platform that will bring us into the modern era." The silence in the room was deafening. Around the conference table my colleagues shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between David and me like spectators at a tennis match. My supervisor, Angela Martinez, looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. The facilities manager, Kevin Park, was studying his hands with the intensity of someone trying to solve quantum physics through palm reading. I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying myself time to process what I'd just heard. Innovate Tech Solutions. I knew that company, knew their reputation for selling expensive, bloated software to executives who confused complexity with sophistication. LogiStream Pro was exactly the kind of one-size-fits-all solution that looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations and functioned like molasses in real-world applications. "David," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, "have you had a chance to review our current performance metrics? Because I think there might be some information you're missing." His smile shifted slightly, becoming sharper around the edge. "Jessica, I appreciate your attachment to the system you've been working with, but sometimes we need to trust the experts. Innovate Tech has been optimizing supply chain operations for Fortune 500 companies, while you've been maintaining internal processes, as if 10 years of innovation, optimization, and genuine technological advancement could be reduced to the digital equivalent of janitorial work, as if the system that had saved North Star millions of dollars and countless hours was just some hobby project I'd been tinkering with in my spare time. But here's what David Torres didn't know about me, what his background check and performance reviews and consultant recommendations had failed to capture. I wasn't just the senior systems analyst who'd been maintaining internal process. I was Jessica Chen, and I had built something extraordinary. Now, let me tell you exactly what David was so eager to replace, and why his mistake was about to become the most expensive lesson in corporate arrogance he'd ever received. "My name is Jessica Chen," and I've been working in supply chain technology for 12 years, the last 10 of which I've spent at North Star Logistics here in Seattle. When I started, I was fresh out of the University of Washington with a degree in computer science and enough student loan debt to fund a small country. I was hired as a junior programmer, tasked with what my then supervisor delicately called digital maintenance of their existing inventory management system. That existing system was a nightmare. Picture software that looked like it was designed during the Clinton administration, because it probably was, database queries that took 45 minutes to process information that should have been instantaneous. User interfaces so counterintuitive that experienced warehouse managers needed 3 days of training just to check stock levels, error rates that were less occasional glitch, and more existential crisis. But instead of just maintaining that digital disaster, I saw an opportunity. During my first month, I spent every lunch break and most of my evenings studying the system's architecture, understanding not just how it worked, but why it failed so spectacularly. I started small, writing simple scripts to automate the most tedious processes, creating shortcuts that saved my colleagues hours of manual data entry. Those small improvements caught the attention of Margaret Sullivan, the facility manager at the time, who encouraged me to think big. "Jessica," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins, "you have a gift for making complicated things simple. Don't waste it on band-aid solutions." So I did. Over the next 2 years, working mostly on my own time and using resources I'd purchased myself, I began designing what would eventually become the Northwest Inventory Management System, or NIMS, as everyone called it. I researched cutting-edge algorithms, studied supply chain optimization theories, and taught myself advanced programming languages that hadn't even existed when our old system was built. The breakthrough came during my 3rd year at North Star. I'd been experimenting with predictive analytics, trying to develop algorithms that could anticipate inventory needs based on seasonal patterns, economic indicators, and historical data. Most experts said it couldn't be done at our scale, that the variables were too complex for a mid-sized logistics operation to process effectively. They were wrong. Working from my apartment kitchen table, fueled by too much coffee and a stubborn refusal to accept that good enough was actually good enough, I cracked the code. I developed a predictive model that could forecast inventory needs, with 94% accuracy up to 6 weeks in advance. Not only could we avoid stockouts and overages, but we could optimize our ordering patterns to take advantage of supplier discounts and seasonal pricing fluctuations. When I presented the prototype to Margaret, she stared at the demonstration for a full 5 minutes without speaking. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Jessica, do you understand what you've built here? This isn't just an improvement, this is revolutionary." She was right. Over the next 3 years, as I continued to refine and expand NIMS, our facility transformed from one of North Star's most problematic operations to its crown jewel. Our processing time decreased by 60%. Our accuracy rate improved to 99, the highest in the company's history. Our inventory carrying costs dropped by 35%, while our service levels increased across every metric that mattered. But the real proof of NIMS's value wasn't in the numbers, impressive as they were. It was in the daily experience of the people who used. Warehouse workers who'd spent years fighting with incomprehensible interfaces suddenly found themselves completing complex tasks with just a few clicks. Supervisors who'd been drowning in paperwork discovered they could manage their entire operation from a tablet. Drivers received optimized routes that got them home to their families an hour earlier each night. Word spread throughout the North Star network. Other facilities began requesting tours of our operation, trying to understand how we'd achieved such dramatic improvement. Competitors started headhunting our staff, hoping to reverse engineer our methods. Industry publications wrote articles about the Seattle miracle, though they never quite understood that the miracle had a name and a social security number. Margaret was promoted to regional director, largely on the strength of our facility's performance, and I was promoted to senior systems analyst with a mandate to help other locations implement similar improvement. But here's where things got complicated. NIMS wasn't just some software package that could be installed and configured. It was a highly customized system that I'd built piece by piece, algorithm by algorithm, specifically for our unique operational requirement. More importantly, the core intellectual property behind NIMS, the predictive algorithms and optimization protocols that made it so effective, weren't just things I'd developed at work. They were based on research I'd begun during my master's program, refined through consulting work I'd done for other companies, and perfected through years of independent study and experimentation. When I'd first started developing NIMS, I'd been paranoid about intellectual property rights. I'd heard too many stories about brilliant developers who'd created valuable technologies, only to discover their employers owned everything. So I'd done my homework, I'd consulted with lawyers, filed the appropriate paperwork, and made sure that my employment contract included specific language protecting pre-existing intellectual property. 3 years ago, on the advice of a patent attorney friend, I'd even filed for patent protection on the core algorithms that powered NIMS, Patent Application 1680-92 4th R45, Predictive Inventory Management System with Integrated Supply Chain Optimization, status approved. Owner Jessica L. Not Northstar Logistics, not some corporate entity or subsidiary. Me. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable precaution, something that might be useful someday if I ever decided to start my own consulting practice, or license my technology to other companies. I never imagined I'd need it to protect myself from my own employer. But sitting in that conference room, listening to David Torres dismiss my life's work as legacy architecture while proposing to replace it with an inferior system that would cost 10 times as much and deliver half the results, I began to realize that my paranoia might have been pressed. Because here's what David and his consulting firm friends didn't understand about NIMS. It wasn't just software that could be unplugged and replaced like a broken print. It was the technological nervous system of our entire operation, integrated into every process, every workflow, every decision that kept millions of dollars worth of inventory moving smoothly through our facility every single day, and legally, contractually and intellectually, it belonged to me. As David continued his presentation, explaining how Logi Stream Pro would revolutionize our operational paradigm and leverage synergistic efficiencies across all touchpoints, I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd had with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With my patent attorney last year, we'd been discussing the potential value of licensing NIMS to other companies, and he'd mentioned something that had stuck with me. Jessica, he'd said, you've created something genuinely valuable here. If Northstar ever decided they didn't want your technology anymore, or if you decided you wanted to take it elsewhere, the market value could be substantial. Supply chain optimization is a billion-dollar industry, and you've solved problems that most companies are still struggling with. At the time, I'd laughed off the suggestion. Why would Northstar not want technology that was making them millions of dollars? Why would I ever want to leave a company where I'd built something so successful? But as I watched David click through his PowerPoint slides, each one more dismissive of my achievements than the last, I began to understand that value isn't always about results. Sometimes it's about perception, about politics, about the need for new leadership to justify their existence by tearing down everything that came before. David wrapped up his presentation with a timeline that was as ambitious as it was absurd: complete migration to Logi Stream Pro within 8 weeks, with minimal disruption to operations and maximum cost saving. The fact that he'd scheduled this transition during our busiest quarter right before the holiday shipping season suggested either stunning ignorance of our business cycle or complete indifference to the consequences of failure. Question, he asked, his tone suggesting that questions were neither expected nor welcome. I raised my hand. Yes, Jessica. David, I'm curious about the cost analysis for this transition. Have you factored in the licensing fees for Logi Stream Pro, the implementation costs, the training requirements, and the productivity losses during the transition period? His smile became strained. Innovate Tech has provided us with very competitive pricing, and their implementation team has assured us that the transition will be seamless. And what about the intellectual property consideration? NIMS includes several patented technologies that are licensed to Northstar under my current employment agreement. How will LogiStream Pro replicate that functionality without infringing on existing patents? The room went very quiet. David's pen clicking increased to a staccato rhythm that suggested his confidence was beginning to crack. I'm not sure I understand the question, he said carefully. The predictive algorithms, the optimization protocols, the integration frameworks that make our current systems so effective, they're protected intellectual property. If we abandon NIMS, we lose access to that technology. LogiStream Pro would need to rebuild equivalent functionality from scratch, which could take months or years, assuming it's even possible without licensing the underlying patents. Angela Martinez leaned forward, her expression shifting from resignation to interest. Kevin Park stopped studying his palms and started paying attention. Around the room I could see the mental calculations beginning, the slow realization that this wasn't just about swapping one piece of software for another. David cleared his throat. Jessica, I think you might be overcomplicating things. Software transitions happen every day in corporate America. I'm sure any intellectual property issues can be resolved through normal legal channels. I'm sure they can. I agree. Though it might be worth understanding exactly what those issues are before we commit to an 8-week timeline. What David didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I'd spent the previous weekend doing exactly that kind of analysis. I'd pulled my employment contract, reviewed my patent documentation, and consulted with my attorney about the implications of Northstar choosing to abandon NIMS in favor of a competing system. The conversation had been illuminating. Jessica, my attorney had explained, your licensing agreement with Northstar is tied to your employment, but it's not exclusive or irrevocable. If they choose to stop using your technology, or if they terminate your employment, the license reverts to you. They would lose access to all the patented algorithms and would be prohibited from using any derivative technologies. And if they wanted to continue using NIMS, after I left, they'd need to negotiate a new licensing agreement directly with you, as the patent holder. Given the value your technology provides to their operation, that could be quite lucrative. How lucrative? Based on the performance improvements you've documented and the cost savings you've generated, I'd estimate the annual licensing value at somewhere between $2 and $4 million, possibly more if other companies in the Northstar network wanted access to the technology. At the time, it had been a hypothetical conversation, an interesting intellectual exercise about the value of innovation and the importance of protecting your work. But sitting in that conference room watching David Torres systematically dismantle everything I'd built, it was beginning to feel very real indeed. The meeting ended with David promising to address any technical concerns and scheduling a follow-up session for the end of the week. As people filed out of the conference room, Angela approached me with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between admiration and concern. Jessica, she said quietly, when you mentioned patents and licensing agreements, were you speaking hypothetically, or is there something I need to know about? I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, at the cranes and construction that never seemed to stop, at a city that had taught me that sometimes you have to build something yourself if you want it done right. Angela, I said, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about exactly what NIMS is, and who owns it, because if David wants to replace my system with LogiStream Pro, he's going to discover that it's not quite as simple as installing new software. She nodded slowly. How not simple are we talking about? I smiled for the first time since David had walked into that conference room. The kind of not simple that's about to make this the most expensive PowerPoint presentation in Northstar's corporate history. Because here's what I was finally beginning to understand. David Torres hadn't just insulted my work or questioned my competence. He'd made the classic mistake of assuming that the quiet woman in the corner was just another employee, whose contributions could be dismissed and replaced at will. But I wasn't just another employee. I was the architect of the most successful operational transformation in company history, the holder of patents worth millions of dollars, and the only person who truly understood how to make supply chain technology serve people instead of enslaving them. And I was about to remind everyone exactly what that was worth. The conversation with Angela that afternoon took place in her office, a corner space on the 14th floor, with windows overlooking Elliott Bay. She'd closed the door and pulled the blinds, creating the kind of privacy that usually meant someone was either getting promoted or fired. Given the morning's events, I was betting on the latter. Jessica, I need you to explain to me exactly what happened in that conference room, Angela said, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone trying to maintain composure. Because what I heard was David proposing a standard software upgrade, and you responding with what sounded like legal threats. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I kept screenshots of our performance metrics. Angela, before we talk about legal anything, I want you to look at some numbers, real numbers, not the sanitized versions that make it into quarterly reports. I slid my phone across her desk, showing her the dashboard I'd built to track NIM's performance in real time. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the data. 47% reduction in processing time compared to our pre-NIMS baseline, 62% improvement in inventory accuracy, 38% decrease in carrying costs, and this number here, I pointed to a figure that still amazed me even after seeing it every day for 3 years, 96.4% customer satisfaction rating, which is the highest in the entire Northstar network. Angela stared at the screen for a long moment. Jessica, these numbers are incredible. How is David looking at performance like this and deciding, we need to change systems? Because David isn't looking at performance, I replied. He's looking at modernization for the sake of modernization. He's been here 6 weeks, he needs to justify his salary, and the easiest way to do that is to tear down what came before, and rebuild it with his name on it. She handed my phone back, her expression thoughtful. But you mentioned patents and licensing agreements. That's not typical for internal software systems. This was the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. For 3 years, I'd been hoping I'd never need to explain the legal complexities of my situation to anyone at Northstar. The fact that my system worked so well and generated so much value had made it easy to avoid uncomfortable questions about ownership and intellectual property. But David's ultimatum had changed everything. Angela, when I first started developing NIMS, I was paranoid about protecting my work. I'd heard too many stories about brilliant engineers who'd created valuable technologies only to discover their companies owned everything, including ideas they'd developed on their own time using their own resources. I opened my laptop and pulled up a document I'd hoped I'd never need to show anyone. This is my employment contract from when I was hired 10 years ago, page 14, section 7, subsection C. It specifically states that pre-existing intellectual property remains with the employee, and that any technologies developed using primarily personal resources and personal time are subject to licensing agreements rather than outright ownership transfer. Angela leaned forward to read the relevant passage, her eyebrows rising as she processed the legal language. Jessica, are you telling me that you own NIMS? I'm telling you that I own the core technologies that make NIMS possible. The predictive algorithms, the optimization protocols, the integration frameworks that allow everything to work together seamlessly. The specific implementation we use here at Northstar is licensed to the company under my employment agreement, but the underlying intellectual property belongs to me. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the distant sound of traffic and the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. Angela was a smart woman, 20 years in logistics management, and I could see her working through the implications of what I'd just told her. How much of NIMS would we lose if you left the company? She finally asked. All of it, I replied. The system is built on patented algorithms that I developed independently. Without those algorithms, you'd have a very expensive user interface with no underlying intelligence. It would be like having a Formula One race car with no engine. Angela's face had gone pale. And Logistream Pro? Logistream Pro is a generic enterprise solution designed for companies that want something that looks sophisticated but doesn't actually push any boundary. It's the technological equivalent of a participation trophy. It would take our processing time from 20 minutes back to 3 hours. Our accuracy rate would drop from 99.7% to somewhere around 85%, which is industry standard but catastrophic by our current benchmarks. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. When she turned back to me,
Her expression had shifted from concern to something approaching panic. Jessica, David has already started the procurement process for LogiStream Pro. He's scheduled implementation meetings with Innovate Tech for next week. If what you're telling me is true, if we lose access to your technology, the performance impact would be devastating. It would be more than devastating, I corrected. It would be business-threatening. We've built our entire operational strategy around the capabilities NIMS provide. Our staffing levels, our customer commitments, our supplier relationships, everything is optimized for the efficiency we currently achieve. If we suddenly need 3 times as long to process orders, and our accuracy rate drops by 15%, we won't just lose customers, we'll face breach of contract claims from every major client we serve. Angela returned to her chair, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind it, gripping the back with white knuckles. How much would it cost to license your technology if you weren't an employee?
I want to protect the facility and the people who work here, I said. But I'm not going to let David destroy something I've spent 10 years building, because he needs to justify his consulting fees. Angela nodded slowly. So what's our next step? Our next step is a meeting with Robert Chen, the regional vice president. David reports to him, and any decision about major technology changes would need his approval anyway. If we're going to have this conversation, we need to have it with someone who has the authority to actually make decisions. And what are we going to tell Robert? I closed my laptop and stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settling around me like a mantle I'd never expected to wear. We're going to tell him the truth, that David's proposal would be the most expensive mistake in North Star's corporate history, and that if he wants to understand why, he needs to learn about the difference between owning technology and licensing it. Angela reached for her phone. I'll set up the meeting for tomorrow morning. Make it early, I suggested. Before David has a chance to schedule any more implementation meetings with Innovate Tech. As I walked back to my desk, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with my patent attorney the previous year, when he'd mentioned the potential market value of my technology. At the time, it had seemed like an abstract concept, interesting but irrelevant to my actual life and career. I was happy at North Star, proud of what I'd built, and confident that my value to the company was sufficient protection against corporate politics and management changes. But corporate politics and management changes have a way of finding you regardless of how valuable you think you are, and David Torres was proof that intelligence and results don't always matter as much as perception and presentation. He'd looked at the most successful operational transformation in company history and seen only outdated technology that needed to be replaced. He'd missed the forest for the trees, focusing on the age of the underlying code, rather than the revolutionary results it produced. It was a mistake that was about to cost him, and potentially North Star, far more than he could possibly imagine. Part 3. The Audience Connection. The meeting with Robert Chen was scheduled for 8 a.m. the next morning in the executive conference room on the 16th floor. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of nervousness, and partly because I wanted time to set up my presentation materials without feeling rushed. The conference room was one of those corporate spaces designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, a table that could seat 20 people, and technology systems that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Angela arrived at 7:55, followed immediately by Robert, who moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. He was in his mid-50s, had been with North Star for nearly 20 years, and had a reputation for cutting through corporate nonsense to focus on results. If anyone was going to understand the implications of David's proposal, it would be him. Jessica, Angela, he said, settling into his chair and opening his tablet. Angela mentioned you have concerns about the LogiStream Pro implementation. I have to admit, I'm curious about what those concerns might be, given that David's proposal seemed fairly straightforward. I'd spent the previous evening preparing for this conversation, organizing my thoughts and evidence into a presentation that would be comprehensive but not overwhelming. The challenge was explaining a complex technological and legal situation to someone who understood business operations, but might not fully grasp the technical nuances of software development and intellectual property law. Robert, before we discuss the LogiStream Pro proposal specifically, I think it would be helpful if you understood exactly what our current system does and why it's been so successful, I began, connecting my laptop to the room's display system. The first slide showed our facility's performance metrics compared to other North Star locations. The differences were stark enough that Robert's eyebrows rose noticeably as he processed the numbers. Our processing speed is 60% faster than the network average. Our accuracy rate is 14 points higher than the next best facility. Our inventory carrying costs are 35% lower than comparable operations. And our customer satisfaction ratings are consistently in the high 90s, while most facilities struggle to maintain scores in the 80s. Robert leaned forward, studying the data with the intensity of someone who understood that numbers like these translated directly into competitive advantage and profitability. These are impressive results, Jessica. How much of this improvement is attributable to your inventory management system? All of it, I replied. When I started here 10 years ago, this facility was one of North Star's problem children. We were slow, error-prone, and expensive to operate. The transformation you're seeing in those numbers is the direct result of the Northwest Inventory Management System that I developed specifically for our operational requirement. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of our performance improvements correlated with NIMS implementation milestones. The relationship was clear and dramatic, with each major system enhancement corresponding to measurable improvements in efficiency and accuracy. The system you see today is the result of 10 years of continuous development and refinement. It's not just software, it's a comprehensive operational philosophy encoded into algorithms that understand our business better than any generic enterprise solution ever could. Robert was taking notes, which I interpreted as a positive sign, and David's proposal would replace this with LogiStream Pro. That's correct. LogiStream Pro is an off-the-shelf enterprise solution designed for companies that want standardized functionality without the complexity of custom development. It's fine for organizations that are satisfied with industry-standard performance, but it would eliminate every competitive advantage we've developed over the past decade. Angela cleared her throat, and I knew we were approaching the more sensitive part of our discussion. Robert, there's something else you need to understand about NIMS, something that significantly complicates David's proposal. I advanced to the next slide, which showed the legal structure of my intellectual property ownership. When I developed NIMS, I was careful to protect my intellectual property rights. The core technologies that make the system so effective, the predictive algorithms and optimization protocols, are covered by patents that I own personally. The room went very quiet. Robert's pen stopped moving, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. Jessica, are you telling me that North Star doesn't own the technology that powers our most successful facility? North Star has an exclusive license to use my technology as part of my employment agreement, but the underlying intellectual property belongs to me. It's an arrangement that's worked well for everyone involved, because the company gets access to cutting-edge technology that would have cost millions to develop internally, and I retain ownership of innovations that I created, largely on my own time using my own resources. Robert set down his pen and looked directly at me. What happens to that license if you leave the company? It reverts to me. North Star would lose access to all patented technologies and would be prohibited from using any derivative systems that incorporate my algorithm. And if we implement LogiStream Pro and discontinue NIMS, the same thing happens. The license is tied to active use of the technology. If North Star chooses to abandon my system, the licensing agreement becomes void. Robert was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him working through the implications. He was a smart executive who'd built his career on understanding operational leverage and competitive positioning. The idea that North Star's most successful facility was dependent on technology owned by a single employee was clearly something he'd never considered. How much would it cost to license your technology if you weren't an employee? He asked. My patent attorney estimates the annual licensing value at between $2 and $4 million. Based on the documented performance improvements and cost savings the technology provides, and the initial cost of LogiStream Pro. Angela consulted her note. $2.3 million for initial licensing and implementation, plus approximately $400,000 annually in maintenance and support fees. Robert did the math quickly. So David is proposing that we spend more money to achieve worse results, while simultaneously giving up access to technology that would cost us millions to license from an external vendor. That's an accurate summary, I confirmed. He stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the Seattle skyline much as Angela had done the previous day. When he turned back to us, his expression had shifted from curiosity to concern. Jessica, I need to understand something. Are you threatening to leave the company if we proceed with Logistream Pro? It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. I'm not threatening anything, Robert. I'm simply explaining the legal and practical realities of the situation. If Northstar decides that my technology is outdated and needs to be replaced, that's certainly the company's prerogative, but it's important that such decisions be made with full understanding of the consequences, and those consequences would be the immediate loss of all competitive advantages we've developed over the past decade, a return to industry-standard performance levels, and the potential for significant operational disruption during the transition period. Plus, of course, the ongoing costs of whatever replacement system is chosen. Robert returned to his seat, but he didn't look comfortable. This is a hell of a situation, Jessica. You've essentially created a dependency relationship where our most successful operation is reliant on technology that we don't control. I'd been expecting this reaction as well, the sense that somehow I'd manipulated the situation to create leverage over the company. It was a natural response from a management perspective, but it missed the fundamental reality of how innovation actually works in corporate environments. Robert, I've been transparent about my intellectual property ownership from the beginning. It's documented in my employment contract, it's been discussed with previous management, and it's never been a secret. The reason it's become an issue now is that David is proposing to abandon technology that works exceptionally well in favor of something that will demonstrably work much worse. But surely we could develop our own equivalent system. Absolutely. It would take between 18 months and 3 years, cost several $1 million in development expenses, and require hiring a team of engineers with expertise in predictive analytics and supply chain optimization. During that development period, you'd be running on whatever replacement system you choose, with all the performance implications that entails. Angela leaned forward. Robert, I've been thinking about this situation all night, and I keep coming back to the same question. Why are we even considering this change? Our current system works better than anything else in the industry. It costs less than what David is proposing to replace it with, and our customers and staff love it. What problem are we trying to solve? It was a question that cut to the heart of the entire controversy. David's proposal wasn't driven by operational necessity or cost savings or customer demand. It was driven by his perception that newer must be better, that standardization was more important than performance, and that his credentials as a consultant gave him insight into our business that somehow trumped 10 years of documented success. Robert saw, the problem we're trying to solve is that David believes our current approach isn't scalable across the Northstar network. He wants standardized systems that can be managed centrally and replicated at multiple facilities. And has anyone asked whether our approach actually is scalable? I replied, because I've spent 3 years helping other Northstar facilities implement modified versions of NIMS, and the results have been consistently positive, wherever management has been willing to embrace the technology. I pulled out my phone and showed Robert a summary of results from the 5 other facilities where we'd implemented NIMS variant. The performance improvements were smaller than what we'd achieved in Seattle, partly because those implementations had been less comprehensive, but they were still significant enough to justify the investment. The Phoenix facility saw a 28% improvement in processing speed. Denver improved their accuracy rate by 12 points. Even the partial implementation in Atlanta resulted in cost savings of over $600,000 annually. Robert studied the data with obvious interest. If these results are replicable, why hasn't the technology been rolled out network-wide? It was a question I'd been asking myself for years, and the answer revealed everything that was wrong with David's approach to technology management. Because previous management decided that custom solutions were too complex to maintain and standardized systems were more important than performance results. They were concerned about creating dependencies on specialized knowledge, even when that specialized knowledge was producing exceptional results. So David's proposal is essentially a continuation of that philosophy. David's proposal is that philosophy taken to its logical extreme. Not only are we rejecting custom solutions in favor of standardized ones, we're actively abandoning the most successful operational transformation in company history to implement something that will demonstrably make us slower, less accurate, and more expensive to operate. The room fell silent again as Robert processed everything we'd discussed. I could see him weighing the political implications of overruling a director he'd recently hired against the operational implications of abandoning technology that was generating millions of dollars in value annually. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jessica, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. If we were to expand NIMS across the entire North Star network, what would that look like from a licensing perspective?" It was the question I'd been hoping he would ask, because it suggested he was thinking beyond the immediate crisis toward the broader strategic implications of the technology I'd developed. That would require a separate licensing agreement for each facility, or a comprehensive network-wide license. The terms would depend on the scope of implementation and the level of support required, but it would represent a significant revenue opportunity for me and a substantial competitive advantage for North Star. "And you'd be interested in that kind of arrangement?" "I'd be very interested, assuming the terms were fair and the implementation was done properly. I've spent 10 years perfecting this technology, and I'd love to see it used to its full potential." Robert nodded slowly. "Give me 24 hours to think about this situation and discuss it with senior management. In the meantime, I'm putting David's LogiStream Pro implementation on hold, pending further review." As Angela and I left the conference room, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that I hadn't experienced since the early days of developing NIM. For the first time since David had dismissed my work as outdated, I was beginning to see a path forward that didn't involve watching 10 years of innovation get discarded in favor of corporate standardization. But I also understood that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of NIMS, but the trajectory of my entire career. Robert's decision would either validate everything I'd built, or confirm that in corporate America, politics and perception still mattered more than performance and result. Part 4: The Power Dynamic Setup. The call from Robert came at 6:30 the next morning while I was drinking coffee and reviewing patent documentation at my kitchen table. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent the night in difficult conversations with people much higher up the corporate hierarchy than either of us. "Jessica, I need you in the office early today. We're having a meeting at 8:15 with some people from corporate headquarters. Dress professionally and bring all your documentation regarding NIMS and your intellectual property ownership." "Who from corporate?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Legal, finance and strategic development. They want to understand exactly what we're dealing with before making any decisions about David's proposal or alternative approach." I arrived at the office at 7:45 to find the executive conference room being prepared for what was clearly a much larger meeting than I'd anticipated. 3 people I didn't recognize were setting up laptops and document binders at one end of the table, while Angela and Robert huddled in conversation near the window. The corporate representatives introduced themselves with the kind of polished efficiency that comes from years of handling sensitive business situations. Patricia Waldman from legal, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of intellectual property dispute in her career. Michael Rodriguez from finance, younger but carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to analyzing complex cost-benefit scenarios, and Sarah Kim from strategic development, who seemed most interested in the technical aspects of what I'd built. David Torres arrived last, looking confused and somewhat defensive. He'd clearly been told this meeting was happening but not why, and his body language suggested he was beginning to suspect that his LogiStream Pro proposal was under more serious scrutiny than he'd anticipated. Patricia opened the meeting with a directness I appreciated. "Ms. Chen, we understand that you've developed proprietary technology that's currently being used by North Star under a licensing arrangement tied to your employment. We need to understand the exact nature of that technology, the legal framework of your ownership, and the implications for the company if we were to lose access to it.
I'd prepared for this conversation more thoroughly than any presentation I'd ever given. The stakes were too high for anything less than absolute clarity about what I'd built and why it mattered. The Northwest Inventory Management System is built on 3 core patented technologies that I developed independently over a period of 7 years. The first is a predictive analytics algorithm that can forecast inventory requirements with 94% accuracy up to 6 weeks in advance. The second is an optimization protocol that minimizes carrying costs while maximizing service level. The third is an integration framework that allows disparate systems to communicate seamlessly in real time. I connected my laptop to the display system and pulled up a technical architecture diagram that showed how these components work together. Each of these technologies is protected by separate patents that I own personally. The specific implementation we use here at Northstar is licensed to the company under my employment agreement, but the underlying intellectual property belongs to me. Sarah Kim leaned forward, studying the diagram with obvious technical interest. Ms. Chen, this architecture is remarkably sophisticated. How long did it take you to develop? The initial concepts emerged during my master's thesis work at the University of Washington, but the practical applications were developed over approximately 5 years of part-time work, mostly evenings and weekends. The patents were filed 3 years ago, and approved 18 months ago. Michael Rodriguez consulted his notes, and the documented performance improvements from this technology. I advanced to the next slide, showing our facility's performance metrics compared to industry benchmarks and other Northstar locations. Processing speed improved by 60%. Accuracy rates increased from 81% to 99.7%, carrying cost decreased by 35%, and customer satisfaction scores improved by nearly 20 points. The numbers were impressive enough that even David seemed taken aback. He'd been focused on the age of the underlying code, and the lack of vendor support, but he'd apparently never bothered to examine the actual results the system produced. Patricia made a note on her legal pad. Ms. Chen, if Northstar were to discontinue use of your technology, what would happen to our access to these systems? The licensing agreement would terminate, and Northstar would lose access to all patented technology immediately. Any attempt to continue using derivative systems or similar algorithms would constitute patent infringement, and if you were to leave the company, the same result. The license is tied to my employment and active use of the technology. Michael leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the financial implications. What would it cost to license this technology if you weren't an employee? My patent attorney estimates the annual licensing value at between $2 and $4 million for a single facility, based on documented cost savings and performance improvements. A network-wide license would be significantly more valuable. The silence that followed was deafening. Even David, who'd been dismissive of my concerns just days earlier, seemed to understand that we were discussing numbers that dwarfed his Logi Stream Pro proposal by an order of magnitude. Sarah Kim broke the silence. Ms. Chen, have you considered licensing this technology to other companies in the industry? It was a question I'd been hoping someone would ask, because it went to the heart of why my intellectual property was so valuable and why David's proposal to abandon it was so short-sighted. I've had inquiries from several competitors including FedEx Supply Chain and UPS Logistics. They're aware of our performance improvements and would be very interested in licensing the technology if it became available. The supply chain optimization market is worth approximately $40 billion annually, and most companies are still using systems that are fundamentally unchanged from designs developed 20 years ago. Patricia's eyebrows rose noticeably. You're saying that competitors would pay millions of dollars annually to license technology that we currently have exclusive access to? That's correct. And if Northstar were to abandon this technology in favor of something like Logi Stream Pro, we'd be voluntarily surrendering a competitive advantage that our rivals would pay almost anything to acquire. David finally spoke up, his voice tight with defensiveness. But surely the risks of depending on a single employee's intellectual property outweigh the benefits. What happens if Jessica gets hit by a bus? What happens if she decides to hold the company hostage for higher licensing fees? It was a fair question, albeit phrased in a way that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I'd anticipated this concern and had prepared a comprehensive response. David, the risk you're describing already exists regardless of who owns the intellectual property. NEMS is complex technology that requires specialized knowledge to maintain and improve. If something happened to me tomorrow, Northstar would face operational challenges whether the system was owned by the company or licensed from me. The difference is that licensing arrangements can be structured to provide continuity and protection for both parties. Patricia looked up from her notes. What kind of continuity provisions would you be willing to include in a licensing agreement? Standard industry protection, source code escrow, detailed documentation, training for internal staff, and succession planning in case of incapacity. The goal isn't to create dependency, it's to ensure that valuable technology continues to serve its intended purpose.
The idea that NIMS could evolve from an internal operational tool into an industry-changing technology platform had always been part of my long-term vision, but I'd never had the corporate support or resources to pursue it seriously. I'd be very interested in that kind of analysis, I replied. I've always believed that this technology could transform supply chain operations, industry-wide, not just at Northstar. Robert stood up, signaling that the meeting was moving toward conclusion. All right, here's what we're going to do. Patricia, I want a full legal analysis of our current licensing arrangement and recommendations for protecting Northstar's interests going forward. Michael, I need a comprehensive financial assessment of the technology's value, both for our internal use and potential external licensing. Sarah, work with Jessica to understand the broader market potential and strategic implications. He turned to David, whose expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his LogiStream Pro proposal was not just postponed, but effectively dead. David, I want you to focus on other operational improvements that don't involve replacing our inventory management system. We'll revisit standardization discussions after we have a better understanding of what we're dealing with. As the meeting ended and people began filing out of the conference room, Sarah Kim approached me with obvious enthusiasm. Jessica, this is fascinating work. I'd love to schedule some time to go through the technical details and understand the development roadmap you envision. I'd welcome that conversation, I replied. I've been developing this technology in relative isolation for years. Having the opportunity to explore its broader potential with corporate resources and strategic support could be incredibly valuable. Patricia lingered as well, her legal mind clearly working through the complexities of the situation. Miss Chen, you should know that what you've accomplished here is genuinely extraordinary, not just from a technical standpoint, but from a business strategy perspective. Most employees who develop valuable intellectual property either don't protect it properly or don't understand its commercial potential. You've done both. After everyone else had left, Angela and I found ourselves alone in the conference room, surrounded by the remnants of what had become the most important business meeting of my career. The view of Elliott Bay seemed different somehow, more expansive, as if the horizon had shifted to accommodate possibilities I'd never seriously considered before. Jessica, Angela said, settling back into her chair with a mixture of exhaustion and excitement, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me since yesterday. Did you always know that David's proposal would force this conversation about intellectual property and licensing? It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting from the moment I'd revealed the extent of my patent ownership. The timing was certainly convenient, and I could understand how someone might interpret my strategic preparation as evidence of long-term manipulation. I didn't plan David's arrival or his decision to replace NIMS, I replied honestly. But I did plan for the possibility that something like this might happen eventually. When you create valuable technology in a corporate environment, you have to assume that management will change, priorities will shift, and political considerations will sometimes override performance results. I pulled out my phone and showed her a folder I'd maintained for 3 years, labeled simply Documentation. It contained screenshots of performance metrics, copies of all relevant legal documents, technical specifications, and financial analyses that demonstrated NIM's value proposition. I've been documenting everything since the day I filed my first patent application, not because I wanted to create leverage over the company, but because I wanted to protect work that I believed was genuinely valuable. Most innovative employees get burned because they can't prove what they've contributed, or they don't understand their legal rights. I was determined not to make those mistakes. Angela scrolled through the documentation, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching admiration. Jessica, this is incredibly thorough. You've essentially built a business case for your own technology without anyone realizing it. That's exactly what I've done. And the reason it's been so effective is that every number, every claim, every projection is based on real performance data that anyone can verify. David's proposal fell apart, not because I sabotaged it, but because he was asking the company to abandon something demonstrably valuable in favor of something demonstrably inferior. We spent the next hour reviewing the morning's meeting and its implications. Angela was particularly interested in the strategic development possibilities that Sarah Kim had raised, recognizing that they represented opportunities not just for me personally, but for the entire facility and everyone who worked there. If Northstar decides to commercialize your technology more broadly, what would that mean for our operation here? She asked. It would mean we'd become the flagship demonstration of what's possible when you optimize supply chain operations using cutting-edge technology. Instead of being just another logistics facility, we'd be a showcase for innovation that customers and industry partners would visit to understand the future of warehouse management. The idea was intoxicating, not just because of the prestige it would bring, but because of what it would mean for our staff and our community. The warehouse workers who'd helped me refine NIMS over the years would become technology demonstrators, sharing their expertise with visitors from around the world. The supervisors who'd trusted my unconventional approaches would be recognized as pioneers in operational innovation. The entire facility would transform from a cost center into a profit center, generating revenue through technology licensing while maintaining our core logistics operations. There's something else to consider, I continue. If we become the center of excellence for this technology, it creates career opportunities for everyone involved. The skills our people have developed using NIMS would be transferable to other facilities, other companies, other industries. We'd be training the next generation of supply chain technology experts right here in Seattle. Angela's smile was the first genuinely enthusiastic expression I'd seen from her in weeks. Jessica, you're talking about fundamentally changing what this facility is and what it represents. That's either incredibly exciting or terrifying depending on how you look at it. I prefer to think of it as incredibly exciting, I replied. We've already proven that the technology works. We've already demonstrated that it can transform operational performance in ways that seemed impossible just a few years ago. The question now is whether we want to keep that transformation limited to our own facility, or share it with the broader industry. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message from Sarah Kim. Jessica, can we schedule a follow-up meeting this afternoon? I'd like to discuss some preliminary market analysis and strategic positioning concepts. This is fascinating work, and I think there are opportunities we haven't even begun to explore. I showed the message to Angela, who shook her head in amazement. 3 days ago, David was calling your system outdated legacy architecture. Now corporate strategic development wants to explore market opportunities for commercializing it. That's quite a transformation. It's what happens when you focus on results instead of perceptions, I replied. David looked at NIMS and saw old technology that needed to be replaced. Sarah looked at the same system and saw innovative solutions that could transform an entire industry. The meeting with Sarah Kim that afternoon took place in a smaller conference room, with just the two of us and a whiteboard covered in market analysis diagrams and strategic positioning concepts. She'd spent the morning researching the supply chain optimization industry, and her findings had clearly impressed her. Jessica, the market research is extraordinary. The global supply chain management software market is projected to reach $63 billion by 2025. And most of that growth is being driven by demand for exactly the kind of predictive analytics and optimization capabilities you've developed. She pointed to a chart showing market segmentation and competitive positioning. The current market leaders are SAP, Oracle, and IBM, but their solutions are primarily focused on enterprise resource planning rather than operational optimization. They're selling comprehensive platforms that do everything adequately rather than specialized tools that do specific things exceptionally well. That's been my observation as well, I replied. Most enterprise software is designed by committees to satisfy the broadest possible range of requirements, which usually means it's overly complex for simple tasks and inadequately sophisticated for specialized needs. Exactly. What you've built is the opposite of that approach. NIMS is laser-focused on solving specific supply chain challenges with unprecedented precision and efficiency. That specialization is exactly what the market is demanding. Sarah had prepared a preliminary competitive analysis that positioned my technology against existing solutions, and the results were striking. In every category that mattered: prediction accuracy, processing speed, implementation complexity, and total cost of ownership, NIMS outperformed enterprise solutions that cost 10 times as much and required armies of consultants to implement. The competitive advantages are almost absurd, she continued. You're delivering Fortune 500 performance capabilities at small business price points, with implementation timelines measured in weeks rather than years. That's because I built it to solve real problems for real people, not to impress procurement committees with feature lists and integration capabilities they'll never actually use. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. And that's exactly why the commercialization potential is so significant. There are thousands of companies struggling with the same supply chain challenges that Northstar faced 10 years ago, and most of them can't afford Oracle or SAP implementations that take 18 months and cost millions of dollars. She turned to a fresh section of the whiteboard and began sketching out a potential go-to-market strategy. If we positioned this as a specialized supply chain optimization solution targeted at mid-market companies, we could capture significant market share while commanding premium pricing because of the demonstrated performance advantages. The numbers she was projecting were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that a properly commercialized version of NIMS could generate between $20 and $50 million in annual licensing revenue within 3 years, with the potential for much larger returns if the technology gained broader market acceptance. Sarah, these projections assume that Northstar would be willing to invest in productizing and marketing my technology. That's a significant departure from the company's current business model. It is, she agreed. But it's also an opportunity to diversify our revenue streams and establish Northstar as a technology leader rather than just a logistics service provider. The supply chain industry is becoming increasingly technology-driven, and companies that can offer proprietary solutions will have substantial competitive advantage. We spent 2 hours exploring different scenarios for commercialization, from simple licensing arrangements with existing software vendors to the development of a dedicated technology division within Northstar. Each approach had different implications for investment requirements, revenue potential, and strategic positioning, but all of them represented dramatic departures from David's proposal to abandon my technology entirely. There's one more thing to consider, Sarah said as our meeting was winding down: the talent acquisition implication. If Northstar becomes known as a company that develops and commercializes cutting-edge supply chain technology, we'll attract the kind of engineers and data scientists who can help expand and improve what you've built. It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered, but it made perfect sense. My work on NIMS had been largely solitary, constrained by limited resources and competing priorities. With proper corporate support and a team of skilled developers, the technology could evolve in directions I'd never been able to explore independently. Jessica, I want to be completely transparent with you about something, Sarah continued. What you've accomplished with NIMS is remarkable, but it's also just the beginning of what's possible. The algorithms you've developed for inventory optimization could be adapted for demand forecasting, route optimization, supplier relationship management, and dozens of other applications. I've thought about many of those possibilities, but developing them properly would require resources and expertise that I don't have access to as an individual contributor. Exactly. Which is why I think we need to have a serious conversation about what kind of role you'd want in a technology commercialization initiative. This isn't just about licensing your existing patents, it's about leading the development of next-generation supply chain solutions that could transform the entire industry. The implications of what she was suggesting were enormous. Instead of being a systems analyst who'd happened to develop valuable technology, I could become the chief technology officer of a new business unit focused on supply chain innovation. Instead of working within the constraints of a single facility's operational requirements, I could design solutions for companies across multiple industries and geographic markets. What would that look like practically? It would mean transitioning from operational support to strategic development, from maintaining existing systems to creating new ones, from serving a single customer to serving an entire market segment. It would also mean building and leading a team of developers, working with sales and marketing professionals, and taking responsibility for the commercial success of the technology you've created. The conversation continued for another hour, exploring organizational structures, compensation arrangements, and timeline considerations for a potential technology commercialization initiative. By the time we finished, I had a much clearer understanding of the strategic options available and the decisions that would need to be made in the coming weeks. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about the dramatic transformation that had occurred in just 3 days. On Monday morning, I'd been a senior systems analyst whose work was being dismissed as outdated by a new director who wanted to implement standardized enterprise software. By Thursday afternoon, I was being courted by corporate strategic development to lead a technology commercialization initiative that could generate tens of millions of dollars in revenue. The change wasn't just professional, it was personal. For 10 years, I'd thought of myself as someone who was good at solving operational problems and building useful tools. I'd never seriously considered that the solutions I'd developed could have value beyond the specific context where I'd created them. The conversations with Sarah Kim had forced me to recognize that I'd been thinking too small, focusing on local optimization rather than global transformation. But with that recognition came responsibility and risk that I'd never had to consider before. Leading a technology commercialization initiative would mean accepting accountability for outcomes that extended far beyond my current sphere of influence. It would mean making decisions that affected not just warehouse operations, but corporate strategy, market positioning, and competitive dynamics across an entire industry. It was the kind of opportunity that most technologists dream about, but few ever encounter: the chance to see innovations developed in relative obscurity achieve broad commercial success and industry impact. But it was also the kind of opportunity that could destroy careers if handled poorly, especially in a corporate environment, where politics and perception often mattered as much as performance and results. The phone call from Robert that evening confirmed that the decision timeline was accelerating faster than I'd anticipated. "Jessica, I've been in discussions with senior management all afternoon, and there's significant interest in moving forward with a comprehensive analysis of commercialization opportunities for your technology. They want to schedule a presentation for next week with the executive committee, including the CEO and chairman of the board." "What kind of presentation are they expecting?" "A full business case for technology commercialization, including market analysis, competitive positioning, financial projections, and organizational requirements. Essentially, they want to understand whether investing in your technology could position Northstar as a major player in the supply chain software industry." The magnitude of what he was describing was almost overwhelming. 3 days earlier, I'd been defending my work against accusations that it was outdated and needed replacement. Now I was being asked to present a business plan for transforming Northstar into a technology company to the most senior leaders in the organization. "Robert, that's an enormous shift in strategic direction. Are they prepared for the investment and organizational changes that would be required?" "They're prepared to consider them, which is more than I expected when this whole situation started." The financial potential Sarah outlined in her preliminary analysis has gotten everyone's attention, especially the board members who've been looking for ways to diversify our revenue streams, and reduce dependence on logistics service margins. And David's LogiStream Pro proposal, officially suspended pending completion of the strategic analysis. Unofficially, I think it's dead. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't make sense when compared to the potential value of what we already have. After ending the call, I sat in my living room for a long time, looking out at the lights of Seattle and trying to process the enormity of what was happening. In the span of less than a week, my entire career trajectory had shifted from maintaining operational systems to potentially leading a major technology commercialization initiative. The opportunity was extraordinary, but so were the challenges. Success would require not just technical expertise but business acumen, leadership skills, and the ability to navigate corporate politics at levels I'd never experienced before. Failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but the waste of genuine innovation that could benefit thousands of companies and millions of workers across the supply chain industry. But as I thought about the warehouse staff who'd helped me refine NIMS over the years, about the efficiency improvements that had made their jobs easier and more productive, about the potential to replicate those benefits across the broader industry, I realized that the opportunity was too important to approach with anything less than complete commitment. The next morning, I began preparing for what would either be the most important presentation of my career or the most spectacular failure I'd ever experienced in a corporate conference room. Part 4, The Power Dynamic Setup, continued. The week leading up to the executive committee presentation was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 10 years at Northstar. My normal responsibilities were temporarily reassigned to other team members, and I found myself working with consultants, analysts, and specialists I'd never known existed within the company's organizational structure. Sarah Kim had assembled what she called a rapid response strategic development team, consisting of market researchers, financial analysts, competitive intelligence specialists, and technology assessment experts. Their job was to validate, refine, and expand upon the preliminary analysis we'd developed during our initial conversations. The market research results were even more encouraging than Sarah's initial projections had suggested. The supply chain optimization software market wasn't just large and growing, it was experiencing a fundamental shift toward the kind of specialized, high-performance solutions that NIMS represented. "Jessica, look at these customer satisfaction surveys," said Maria Santos, one of the market researchers. "Companies using traditional enterprise systems rate their inventory management capabilities at an average of 6.2 out of 10. They're spending millions of dollars on software that barely meets their needs and requires constant customization and support." The competitive analysis was equally revealing. While companies like SAP and Oracle dominated market share through comprehensive enterprise platforms, customer feedback consistently highlighted the same complaints: excessive complexity, slow implementation, poor user experience, and inadequate performance optimization. "There's a classic innovator's dilemma situation developing," explained Tom Chen, the competitive intelligence specialist. "The market leaders are focused on adding features and expanding platform capabilities, but they're losing sight of the core problems that customers actually need solved." NIMS represented the exact opposite approach. Instead of trying to do everything adequately, it focused on doing specific things exceptionally well. The predictive algorithms, optimization protocols, and user interface design were all optimized for supply chain professionals who needed tools that made them more effective, rather than more overwhelmed. The financial modeling was perhaps the most striking aspect of the analysis. Working with Michael Rodriguez and his team, we'd developed revenue projections based on 3 different commercialization scenarios: conservative, moderate, and aggressive market penetration. Even the conservative scenario, which assumed modest market acceptance and limited geographic expansion, projected annual licensing revenues of $35 million within 5 years. The moderate scenario suggested revenues of $68 million, while the aggressive scenario projected over $100 million annually. "Jessica, these numbers are based on conservative pricing assumptions and realistic market penetration rates," Michael explained. "We're not assuming that NIMS will capture huge market share overnight. We're modeling gradual adoption by companies that value performance over brand recognition."
The organizational requirements analysis was more complex and raised questions that I'd never seriously considered before. Commercializing NIMS would require building a complete technology division within Northstar, including software development, product management, sales, marketing, and customer support capability. The good news is that Northstar has the financial resources and corporate infrastructure to support this kind of expansion, said Jennifer Walsh, the organizational development consultant. The challenging news is that it would represent a fundamental shift in company culture and strategic focus. We spent 2 days developing organizational charts, staffing plans, and budget requirements for different levels of technology division investment. The costs were substantial, ranging from $12 million for a minimal viable product approach to $45 million for a comprehensive market entry strategy. But when compared to the projected revenue potential, even the most expensive option offered compelling return on investment calculations. More importantly, the technology division would generate high-margin recurring revenue that could significantly improve Northstar's overall financial profile. Traditional logistics services operate on razor-thin margins because they're essentially commodity businesses, Michael explained. Technology licensing, especially for specialized solutions like NIMS, offers profit margins that are 3 to 5 times higher than service delivery. The risk assessment was sobering but manageable. The primary concerns were market acceptance uncertainty, competitive response from established players, and execution challenges associated with scaling from a single facility implementation to a multi-industry platform. The technology risk is minimal because NIMS has already proven its effectiveness in real-world operations, noted Rachel Kim, the technology assessment specialist. The market risk is higher because we're making assumptions about customer willingness to adopt new solutions, but the customer research suggests strong demand for exactly what we're offering.
The idea that my work could evolve into a strategic initiative that might transform an entire company seemed almost surreal, but as I reviewed the presentation materials one final time, I realized that the opportunity wasn't really about me or my technology. It was about demonstrating that innovation could emerge from anywhere within an organization, that employee creativity and initiative could generate value that extended far beyond traditional job descriptions and departmental boundaries. The executive committee meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the boardroom on the 18th floor, a space I'd never seen before despite working in the building for a decade. When I arrived 15 minutes early, I found Patricia Waldman and Sarah Kim already setting up presentation materials and testing the room's audio-visual systems. "Jessica, are you ready for this?" Patricia asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The executive committee began arriving promptly at 9 o'clock. I recognized some faces from company newsletters and annual meetings, but most of these people existed in a corporate stratosphere far removed from my normal interactions. Robert Chen made introductions around the table. James Morrison, the CEO, was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 50s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd built his career on making difficult decisions quickly and effectively. Margaret Thompson, the chairman of the board, had a reputation for asking penetrating questions and cutting through corporate nonsense to focus on substantive issues. David Torres was notably absent from the meeting, which I interpreted as a clear signal about the fate of his LogiStream Pro proposal. "Miss Chen," James Morrison began, "we understand that you've developed technology that could represent a significant commercial opportunity for Northstar. We're interested in understanding both the potential benefits and the practical requirements for pursuing that opportunity." I'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but actually facing the executive committee was different from any practice session. These were people who made decisions that affected thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The weight of that responsibility was palpable in the room. "Thank you for the opportunity to present this analysis," I began. 10 years ago, I joined Northstar to help solve operational challenges in our Seattle facility. What I discovered was that the fundamental approaches to supply chain optimization used throughout the industry were inadequate for the performance requirements that modern companies face. I clicked to the first slide, showing our facility's performance transformation over the past decade. The technology I developed to address those challenges has generated dramatic improvements in processing speed, accuracy, and cost efficiency. But more importantly, it's demonstrated that supply chain operations can achieve performance levels that most companies consider impossible. The presentation flowed smoothly through market analysis, competitive positioning, and financial projection. The executive committee asked thoughtful questions about technical scalability, implementation timelines, and competitive differentiation, but their overall response seemed positive. Margaret Thompson leaned forward during the organizational requirements section. Ms. Chen, you're proposing that Northstar invest up to $45 million to build a technology division around your intellectual property. That's a substantial commitment for a company that's never been in the software business. You're absolutely right, I replied. It is a substantial commitment, and it does represent a significant departure from Northstar's traditional business model. But the financial projections suggest that the return on investment would be exceptional, and the strategic positioning would give Northstar competitive advantages that would extend far beyond technology licensing revenue. James Morrison consulted his notes. The revenue projections are certainly attractive, but they're based on assumptions about market acceptance that haven't been tested. What gives you confidence that companies will pay premium prices for supply chain optimization software? It was the question I'd been most concerned about, because it went to the heart of whether the commercial potential we'd identified would translate into actual market success. Mr. Morrison, the confidence comes from three sources. First, our own experience demonstrates that companies will invest heavily in solutions that deliver measurable performance improvements. Second, the market research shows widespread dissatisfaction with existing enterprise solutions and strong demand for specialized alternatives. Third, I've already received inquiries from potential customers who are aware of our performance improvements and interested in licensing the technology. What kind of inquiries? Margaret Thompson asked. Both competitors and companies in related industries have approached me about potential licensing arrangements. FedEx Supply Chain, UPS Logistics, and several major retailers have expressed interest in understanding how our technology could be adapted for their operation. The room went quiet as the implications sank in. These weren't hypothetical customers or theoretical market opportunities. These were major companies that had already validated the commercial potential of my technology by expressing willingness to pay for access to it. Sarah Kim leaned forward to support my point. The preliminary discussions with potential customers suggest that demand significantly exceeds our most optimistic projection. Companies are willing to pay premium prices for solutions that can deliver the kind of performance improvements that NIMS has demonstrated. The financial discussion continued for nearly an hour, with Michael Rodriguez presenting detailed cost-benefit analyses and return on investment calculations. The numbers were compelling enough that even the most conservative board members seemed intrigued by the potential. The technology division would be profitable within 18 months and would generate positive cash flow that could fund expansion into additional market segments, Michael explained. More importantly, the intellectual property portfolio would become a valuable corporate asset that could be leveraged for strategic partnerships or eventual divestiture if market conditions change. James Morrison looked around the table, clearly gauging the sentiment of other committee members. Ms. Chen, if we were to approve this initiative, what role would you envision for yourself in the technology division? It was the question that would determine not just the fate of the commercialization initiative, but the trajectory of my entire career. The answer I gave would commit me to responsibilities and challenges that extended far beyond anything I'd experienced as a systems analyst. I would want to serve as Chief Technology Officer, responsible for product development, technical strategy, and technology partnership. I've spent 10 years developing expertise in supply chain optimization, and I believe I could lead a team that would establish Northstar as the industry leader in specialized logistics technology. Margaret Thompson smiled for the first time during the meeting. Ms. Chen, that's exactly the kind of commitment and vision we'd need to see for an initiative of this magnitude. Are you prepared for the challenges of scaling from a single facility implementation to a multi-industry technology platform? I'm prepared to learn and grow into those challenges, I replied. I have the technical foundation and the industry knowledge, and I'm confident that with proper corporate support and a skilled team, we can build something extraordinary. The meeting concluded with what James Morrison described as cautious optimism about the commercialization opportunity. The executive committee would review the business case over the following week and make a final decision about whether to proceed with technology division development. As I left the boardroom, I realized that regardless of their decision, the presentation had fundamentally changed my relationship with North Star and my understanding of my own capabilities. I was no longer just an employee who'd happened to develop valuable technology. I was a technologist with proven commercial potential and strategic vision for industry transformation. The next week would determine whether that transformation would happen at North Star or somewhere else entirely. Part 5. The merit documentation. The call from James Morrison came on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the executive committee presentation. I was in the middle of reviewing system performance metrics when my phone rang, displaying the CEO's direct line. "Jessica, do you have a few minutes to talk? I have some news about the technology commercialization initiative." The tone of his voice was neutral, giving no indication of whether the news would be positive or devastating. I'd spent the entire week oscillating between confidence and anxiety, alternately convinced that the business case was compelling and terrified that the executive committee would decide the risks outweighed the potential benefits. "Of course, Mr. Morris, I'm available whenever it's convenient for you. Actually, I'd prefer to have this conversation in person. Can you come up to my office in about 10 minutes? James Morrison's office occupied a corner of the 19th floor, with panoramic views of Seattle and Puget Sound. The space was more functional than opulent, with walls covered in operational charts, financial projections, and strategic planning documents, rather than expensive artwork or corporate memorabilia. "Jessica, please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I want to start by telling you that your presentation last week was one of the most impressive business cases I've seen in my 15 years as CEO of this company." The relief was immediate and overwhelming, though I tried to maintain professional composure. "Thank you, Sarah Kim and her team were invaluable in developing the analysis. The analysis was excellent, but what impressed me most was your understanding of both the technical details and the commercial implications. Most engineers can explain how their technology works, but very few can articulate why it matters to customers and how it could transform an entire industry." He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a formal corporate document. The executive committee voted unanimously to approve the technology commercialization initiative, with an initial investment commitment of $32 million over the next 18 months. The number was substantial enough to make my head spin. $32 million represented more resources than I'd ever imagined having access to, enough to build a comprehensive technology division and position North Star as a serious competitor in the supply chain software market. "Mr. Morrison, that's an extraordinary commitment. I'm honored by the confidence you're placing in this initiative." "The confidence is well earned," he replied, "but I want to be clear about expectations and accountabilities. This isn't just an experiment or a pilot program. This is a strategic bet on transforming North Star into a technology-enabled logistics company, and success will be measured by concrete business results." He slid the document across his desk to me. "This is the formal charter for the new technology division, with you designated as Chief Technology Officer reporting directly to me. The division will have autonomy to develop products, establish customer relationships, and build the organizational capabilities necessary for commercial success." Reading through the charter was surreal. My name appeared throughout the document as the executive responsible for product strategy, technology development, customer acquisition, and revenue generation. The scope of authority and responsibility was far beyond anything I'd experienced in my career. The initial focus will be on productizing NIMS for commercial licensing, while developing next-generation capabilities that can address broader market opportunities, James continued. "We're giving you the resources to hire a world-class development team, establish partnerships with industry leaders, and build the technology portfolio that will position Northstar as the innovation leader in supply chain optimization. The implications were staggering. Instead of being a systems analyst who'd happened to develop valuable technology, I was being positioned as the technology leader for an ambitious corporate transformation initiative. The success or failure of Northstar's evolution into a technology company would depend largely on my ability to execute the vision we'd presented to the executive committee. Mr. Morrison, I want to make sure I understand the scope of what you're proposing. Are you saying that Northstar is willing to commit $32 million to building a technology division around intellectual property that I own personally? That's exactly what I'm saying, with appropriate legal protections for both parties. Patricia Waldman has been working with external counsel to structure licensing arrangements that provide Northstar with the rights and access we need, while ensuring that you're fairly compensated for the intellectual property you've developed. He handed me another document, this one significantly thicker and marked confidential intellectual property licensing agreement. The terms were more generous than anything I'd dared to hope for when this entire situation began. The licensing arrangement provides Northstar with exclusive rights to commercialize your current patents and any related technologies you develop in your role as CT. In return, you'll receive a base salary of $250,000 annually, plus equity participation in the technology division that could be worth millions of dollars if the commercialization succeeds. The financial terms were extraordinary, representing more than triple my current salary plus upside potential that could transform my personal financial situation entirely. But more importantly, the arrangement provided the corporate support and resources necessary to realize the full potential of the technology I'd developed. There's one more thing, James continued. The board has approved the acquisition of a 50,000 square foot technology campus in Bellevue specifically for the technology division. You'll have state-of-the-art development facilities, conference centers for customer demonstrations, and the physical infrastructure to support rapid team growth. The scope of the commitment was breathtaking. Northstar wasn't just investing in my technology, they were betting the company's future on the vision we'd developed for industry transformation. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity to build something genuinely revolutionary. Mr. Morrison, I'm grateful for this opportunity and committed to making it successful. When would you like me to start in the CTO role? Immediately. Your first priority is hiring a core development team and establishing the product roadmap for the next 12 months. Sarah Kim will be transitioning to the technology division as Vice President of Strategic Development, and you'll have access to corporate resources for recruiting, marketing, and business development. The meeting concluded with James walking me through the organizational structure, reporting relationships, and success metrics that would govern the technology division's operation. The goals were ambitious but achievable: demonstrate commercial viability within 6 months, achieve profitability within 18 months, and establish market leadership within 3 years. As I left his office with signed contracts and corporate credit cards that represented more financial resources than I'd ever controlled, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 weeks earlier, David Torres had dismissed my work as outdated legacy architecture that needed to be replaced. Now I was the chief technology officer of a new corporate division with a mandate to transform an entire industry. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. For 10 years I'd thought of myself as someone who was good at solving problems and building useful tools. I'd never seriously considered that the solutions I'd developed could become the foundation for a technology company that might influence how millions of people worked and how thousands of companies operated. But as I walked through the facility that afternoon, seeing the warehouse workers who'd helped me refine NIMS over the years, I realized that the opportunity was bigger than personal success or corporate transformation. It was about demonstrating that innovation could emerge from anywhere, that individual creativity and persistence could generate value that extended far beyond traditional job descriptions and organizational boundaries. The announcement of my promotion and the technology division's formation was made the following Monday at an all-hands meeting in the main warehouse. The response from my colleagues was overwhelmingly positive, though I could see some surprise on faces of people who'd never imagined that the quiet systems analyst could become a corporate executive. Jessica has built something extraordinary here,
Robert Chen told the assembled staff. The technology division represents our commitment to sharing that innovation with companies around the world, while maintaining our position as the most efficient logistics operation in the industry. Angela Martinez approached me after the meeting with a mixture of pride and concern. Jessica, I'm incredibly happy for you, but I have to ask, what happens to our operation here while you're building a technology company? It was a legitimate concern. The Seattle facility would continue to be our primary demonstration site and testing ground for new capabilities, but my responsibilities would necessarily extend far beyond maintaining the systems that had made our success possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.